Alright then, hardware assurance. Now, what the heck is that? Hardware assurance is all about protecting your hardware, not your software. So we're protecting against malware and attacks, but from a hardware standpoint, from a hardware point of view. And while hardware exploits are perhaps not so common since they are extremely difficult to develop and to implement, to deliver, you still need to have some certainty that the hardware that you're using to handle sensitive data has not been compromised. So we introduced the concept of supply chain assessment, and the main idea starts from the fact that a lot of companies rely on off-the-shelf products. You might need a new laptop, a switch, a printer. You just buy whatever is available. Now, most of the time, you just have to trust that the hard drive, the computer, the wireless access point that you're buying has not been compromised in some way, that it doesn't call home, that it doesn't perform sniffing on you, no key logging, and doesn't have any malware installed on it. We are used to assume that whatever we buy is safe and fine, it's okay, at least at the moment of purchase. But for some larger companies, this is not enough. And especially governments, they don't just trust that easily and have very strict connections with their suppliers. So if you're one of them, you have to make sure that the vendor of your hardware or software did not include something undesirable, like a backdoor or some spyware software within the solution that they're delivering to you. And I would strongly encourage you to read about a very bad but very recent example, the SolarWinds supply chain attack. If you haven't heard about it from the news, from the media, it's a good time to understand just how dangerous a supply chain vulnerability or a supply chain attack can be. Alright, so how do you validate your hardware vendor? Well, to mitigate and ensure that the supply chain has been compromised, you can start with, common sense, right? Also known as vendor due diligence. Basically, this means checking at least the following about your vendor. Does it have any risk management program in its development, manufacturing, shipping? How well are the products supported during their lifetimes? Can you expect any more security patches later on after you purchase the product? Does it provide any assistance to you with forensic investigations if the situation requires it? And perhaps even incident response. And generally think about or evaluate their historical reliability. Read about them. See if they have been proven to be trustworthy in the past. And now, it might be obvious here, but I have to mention this. Even if you trust the supplier, that doesn't mean you can also trust secondhand or gray market products from that same vendor. Simply because that's a completely different supply chain, and you know nothing about it. You have no control over the source of that equipment. You don't know who had their hands inside of that equipment and who perhaps made some malicious changes in that hardware. Another check of the supply chain is called the Trusted Foundry program, set up by the US DoD, that's the Department of Defense, and includes a list of accredited suppliers that have proven to have a secure supply chain, down to their factories, their assembly facilities, so that all electronics that you get from those vendors, you can be pretty sure that they don't contain backdoors. And this was established to keep out vendors from countries that cannot prove this. We might know who they are, but I won't be naming them because they are surely monitoring me right now and I don't want them to poison my dog. Alright, next one on the list is Hardware Root of Trust, ROT, or Trust Anchor. And it's all about securing the hardware in our machines by using a secure subsystem dedicated to providing attestation about our systems. What the heck is attestation? Well, attestation means proving that something is true, right? Not clear yet? Basically, you have a device in your computer that every single time your computer connects to the network, digitally signs, and then sends a digital report saying that this machine is okay. It scans the boot metrics, it scans the operating system files, it confirms that they haven't changed so that this machine is not booting with any malware in it. Is not booting from a malicious modified operating system, infected operating system, or a rootkit inside of the system files. Now, physically, this root of trust is normally implemented using something called a TPM, Trusted Platform Module, and that's a chip that stores everything related to cryptographic operations like digital certificates, keys, private keys. This can be a separate chip, or as a function on the CPU itself, on the processor itself. So we're really going deep into the hardware here. Now, TPM chips come with a hard-coded, unchangeable private key called the endorsement key. Now, this key is used to generate all the other keys that you're going to be using to sign emails, encrypt disks. With Windows BitLocker, for example, that key is also derived from this endorsement key. And the very important function of the TPM is to keep this cryptographic content out of reach. Now, of course, if we are working with sensitive information like cryptographic keys, we need to secure this environment, this TPM environment. And usually TPM chips are tamper-proof, meaning that if you try to mess with it, it's going to self-destruct its contents, a process known as crypto shredding. Now, this is done by using something called a PUF, PUF. That's a physical unclonable function, which is a unique signature made up of distinct features of the device the TPM is running on. So if you try to tamper with the TPM chip, change its inputs, or connect it to some other system and try to hack it, it's going to fail, and the self-destruct crypto shredding is going to be engaged. Look how many cool words I used in just one sentence. Now, there is a limited amount of interaction that you can perform using this TPM chip, one of them being erasing the TPM chip or resetting the cryptographic information from it. And you can just do this either from the BIOS of the computer itself or directly from the operating system. In case of Windows, you can do it through group policy. And there's actually a dedicated interface for this. You can access it using tpm.msc in the Run window or right in the Start menu. We also have HSMs, or hardware security modules. They're basically an alternative to TPMs. They actually work like a removable TPM, so they're going to store the exact same kind of information like certificates and keys. Now, the reason these devices exist is that the TPM was designed to be used to generate asymmetric key pairs, public and private keys, all right? And the TPM makes sure that the private key never leaves the machine on which it was generated. Now, sometimes in the enterprise environment, in your company, you need to keep those private keys someplace else, safe, like in key escrow or in air-gapped systems. So this is where an HSM is useful because it can actually be removed like any other component and moved to another system. Also applies when you're basically refreshing the infrastructure. You know, you're changing the servers, you're upgrading the servers, but you still want to retain the same cryptographic information that you've been using up to that point. Now, there are a ton of hardware security modules vendors out there. I would just mention here the solutions from Intrust and the ones from Thales. Another place where the HSM is often used is in cloud environments, because in cloud environments, a lot of customers use the same shared infrastructure. So we need some sort of secure storage space where everybody can access their own cryptographic information. And you can actually rent either physical HSMs in servers or partitions in dedicated HSMs where you can just store your cryptographic information along with the keys of other customers, of course, without having direct access to their information. So cryptographic storage in the cloud is often found under the term of a vault for keys, which in turn is either implemented directly in software, or if you pay some more for a dedicated infrastructure, you're going to have access to an actual HSM somewhere in a cloud server. Another important concept is trusted firmware, and protecting the firmware of a device is extremely important because that code always runs with the highest privilege. It's the first code that runs, and it's the first code that has complete access to the entire device. And the purpose of the firmware is to first perform the hardware checks, to initialize all the hardware, and then to allow you to interact further on, maybe load a dedicated operating system and other operations like these. Now, a firmware exploit would definitely give an attacker the highest level of privileges. And speaking of firmware, we have to mention BIOS. You probably heard about BIOS in a computer. That's the basic input and output system. It's the industry standard code that boots up and initializes your PC whenever you press the power button. Now, unfortunately, BIOS is somewhat old. It doesn't have any security built in. That's why we have UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Kind of descriptive name if you think about it. After it was invented, UEFI started slowly becoming the standard for all PCs. Now, UEFI is also a requirement if you plan on using TPM chips from your devices. But UEFI can do so much more. For example, you can get access to something called Secure Boot, which means that the UEFI firmware can use digital certificates and digital signatures from valid operating system vendors. You don't need me to tell you which valid operating system vendors are out there, right? This means that the bootloader cannot be changed with something malicious or replaced. You cannot trick the computer into booting a different operating system, like from a live CD or a USB drive. So that's a great security benefit. Another one is measured boot and attestation. Now, measured boot does not mean measuring how long it takes your computer to boot, but it's another function of UEFI and can use the TPM chip's key to hash and sign the system's state, which means its configuration, its boot settings, the operating system kernel, gathers all this information and then sends this summary to an external server, like a network access control server, whenever the PC starts booting up and attempts to connect to the network. The NAC server checks this information and allows access to the network depending on the quality of the security report of that host. This is measured boot. And these kind of checks are very useful because they can detect indicators of compromise before they can even manifest. I mean, before you can even allow that computer to boot, not to mention allow that computer network access into your internal network. Another concept here, an important one, is trusted firmware updates. So we have secure boot, we have measured boot, so we can be sure that no unauthorized operating system is going to boot on our hosts. But what if somehow the firmware itself gets replaced with malicious version? Man, so many things to secure in here. Where does it end? So how do you secure your firmware, or how do you secure a firmware update? Well, just like with any other piece of code, you can digitally sign it. Now the problem is, how does the CPU know which signatures are valid and which are not? Well, this is solved by a technology such as Intel Boot Guard that takes the public keys for authorized firmwares and fuses them in your device so that they cannot be changed. Now, the end result is that other firmware is not going to be accepted if it's not signed by the actual vendor key. I don't know, from Microsoft, from Gigabyte, from Lenovo, from whatever server manufacturer or even laptop manufacturer you have, then it's not going to be accepted. We're only going to accept the vendors whose public keys are hard-coded within the CPU or within a dedicated subsystem of that CPU. Now, if this sounds extremely restrictive, it actually is, and that's exactly the point behind it. And if you thought that you were done with locking down our PCs, we have one more method left, and that is called an eFuse. It's a hardware fuse meant to lock programming in place so that it cannot be changed. What the heck does this mean? Well, let me show you what it does. As the device gets its firmware updated, the device blows an electrical fuse every single time. I'm not kidding. It actually blows an electrical fuse. There's no smoke coming out, but it's a microscopic fuse in there. But when a new update comes in, the update code actually goes ahead and checks the number of firmware fuses already blown. If it's not the expected number, then it's going to be assumed that the firmware was tampered with in the meantime. And this is actually one of the reasons why hacking or jailbreaking phones, iPhones, gaming consoles like Xboxes and PlayStations or cars is made so difficult nowadays, because they rely on this type of hardware security that cannot be bypassed so easily. One more concept that is pretty self-explanatory is called self-encrypting drives, or SEDs. The purpose behind a self-encrypting drive, and when I say drive, we're actually referring to hard drives or SSDs, right? The purpose is to offload the encryption function to the drive itself, so it doesn't use the operating system resources like the server's CPU or your laptop CPU actually. Now, self-encrypted drives use something called a MEK, a media encryption key, to encrypt that data, and they store it securely by encrypting it with a KEK, a key encryption key, which is generated from the user's password entered at the OS level. Now, if you thought that your password 123 is the one that is actually used to encrypt the data on the disk, now you're wrong. It's derived from your password, but the actual encryption key is much stronger than whatever puny password you chose to use as your login password. All right. Now, the keys for SEDs are not usually stored in the TPM, since it's assumed that you might want to move the drives to another system. and still be able to decrypt them simply by supplying a password at the operating system level. So think about it. If you were to store the password within the TPM, you cannot remove the TPM and move it along with the drive itself. So you're kind of stuck with using that drive within that specific server forever. Not to be desired. Last topic here, I promise. Secure processing. And the idea behind secure processing is the fact that a lot of the exploits are designed to access unauthorized memory areas and exfiltrate sensitive information from there. No news here, I suppose. Now, secure processing is a concept that attempts to make sure that sensitive data in memory is not accessed by nasty processes. And this concept is implemented in a number of ways. One of them is called trusted execution. This one uses the TPM and that secure boot attestation that we talked about a couple of minutes ago to make sure that only a valid operating system is running and no malicious kernel gets executed at boot time. Another one is secure enclave. It's basically a secure area or a secure container, I would say, but I would not want to abuse the term container here because it's not about Docker containers. It's just a partition, so to say, a secure partition created by a trusted process where it stores the cryptographic keys, if the operating system is trusted. Now, the purpose of this secure enclave is to make those buffer overflows almost impossible because there's no way to overwrite any of the information from that secure enclave. Another one is processor security extensions, like low-level CPU instructions that enable secure processing. We have technologies here such as SME, that's Secure Memory Encryption on AMD, and TXT, that's Trusted Execution Technology on Intel. And we also have Software Guard Extensions, SGE, also on Intel. I wouldn't suggest that you remember much more than these acronyms for the exam. Atomic execution is another interesting one because it refers to an indivisible operation. Now, those are operations that are executed entirely or not at all. This type of execution protects against race conditions, where you don't know exactly what the end result of the operations is going to be, buffer overflows, or time of check, time of use issues. Remember that one? Talked about it a couple of videos ago. Now, time of check, time of use, just to refresh your memory, means that when a resource needs to be changed, it should first be checked for its state and then changed. Now, these two operations, the check and change itself, have to be executed as a whole, and while they're executed, no other checks or changes can be performed on that resource. Otherwise, we risk bringing the resource to an inconsistent state. So that's another definition, actually, of an atomic operation. Check the resource and make the change in one single operation. Don't leave any other entity access the resource in the meantime, or, God forbid, change it. And finally, we have bus encryption as a last secure processing method. Basically, it's about securing data in transit, not on the network, mind you, but inside the internal circuitry of your PC, like between the PCI cards, through the HDMI cable that you're transmitting video signals to your TV or your display or your capture card, or USB devices. Now, usually these are not encrypted, but there's still raw data traveling in there, which might be sensitive data. So bus encryption makes sure that the device at the other end of the bus is trusted. This concept is often used on encrypted HDMI links for DRM purposes, digital rights management, for protecting movies, for example, or any devices that are HDCP capable, that's high bandwidth digital content protection, and that can play encrypted content. Now, this is an entire different story here, which is much better addressed inside the Security Plus training. But just to give you a glimpse, the idea of transmitting encrypted information and then the encryption key over the same link, like when you need to encrypt the traffic over an HDMI cable and you just have a dumb monitor at the other end, which is HDCP capable. Well, transmitting the encrypted content and the key over the same link is basically security by obscurity. This is one of the reasons why DRM in digital media and music, movies, games, software, and so on has pretty much always been defeated so far, because there's basically no way to hide that cryptographic key along with the encrypted content and make sure that nobody else is ever going to find it. Because you need to transmit the key along with the encrypted content, otherwise how is the end TV at the other end of the HDMI cable going to know to decrypt that content? That's the only way we can communicate with that TV. We have to send the key along with the encrypted content over the same link. And it's really tough to do out in plain sight. Alright, so that's it about hardware assurance. We talked about a lot of stuff here. We started talking about supply chain assessment, talked about hardware root of trust, trust anchor, talked about TPM chips, HSM cards. I would have said modules, but HSM actually means hardware security module. Talked about trusted firmware, BIOS, UEFI, eFuses, self-encrypting drives, and secure processing methods. So I don't think I need to mention at this point in the training that you really need to know this stuff for the end exam. Alright, so good luck until next time when we're going to be talking about black holes and sinkholes. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hope to see you on the next video. Bye bye.